Just a few short years after Kansas became a state, a military fort was established in its western half in an area that would eventually become the city of Hays. In this episode of History in Hays, we learn who worked at the fort, what they did, and why their history is preserved today. Welcome to History in Hays, a series examining several historic events that happened in Hays and the surrounding areas. Today is our first episode, and we're going to be talking about Fort Hays. I'm Reagan Neufeld, and with me is Adam Conkey, Site Administrator at the Fort Hays State Historic Site. Adam, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Reagan.
So, before we really start, can you first just tell us a little bit about what you do as a Site Administrator and how long you've been in this position?
I've been in this position since May of this year, so fairly new at it. But I've been working out here part-time for 2 years before that. A lot of what I do out here is event planning, trying to get community involvement from Hays to get more people out here to visit that are locals. And it's notorious in the museum industry to get locals to come visit something in their own town. They'll go out of town, but they won't come in big numbers out to local sites as much. At least that's what we've experienced out here at Fort Hays. I've get people from Netherlands or Finland or Japan. I don't seem to get as many Hays people, but I get a lot of international people out here. Most of what I do is sort of maintenance, make sure the site looks good and it's not falling apart. And it's general maintenance, really, what I do, and answer emails and stock the gift shop, all kind of boring things that don't seem too historical. But then I get to have conversation like this once in a while.
Yeah. So myself being a student at Fort Hays State University, every once in a while I will run into someone who maybe doesn't know the university or even know Hays, and they'll ask, why is it called that? Is it, what's it named after? And of course we know that it's named after a military fort that was here, and it was established shortly after the end of the Civil War. Is that correct?
That's right. 1865. Technically, it was called, at that time, Fort Fletcher, and it was named after the Missouri governor who was in office at the time. He basically came into office at the beginning of that year, and so he'd only been in office about 7 or 8 months before they named a fort after him. But he was Republican since about 1856. He was a delegate that advocated for electing Lincoln in 1860, and so he was kind of high up there on the list. And Missouri being a battleground state, he got some accolade out of that. And politics is what it is. Some people get recognition for things they might not necessarily need to have at that point in their lives. A lot of the forts are named after generals or somebody that had passed away or died in the war. Or they're big heroes of at least at that time, of the Union Army, the Federal Army. So later on it becomes Fort Hays.
Interesting, yeah. It didn't take all that long for it to become Fort Hays, did it?
It took a year. It took about a year. So October 1865, they decided to send a group out here, and they were supposed to guard the Butterfield Overland Dispatch stagecoach line out to the gold fields in Denver and Colorado Springs, and protect them from Indian raids if there happened to be any. And at that time, we'd gotten ourselves involved in quite a few things, accidentally or on purpose, where we had agitated a few of the tribes out here in this region. And Hays City and Fort Hays itself, where it's located, happens to be right in the middle of the confluence of a lot of different tribal network. So you got Panhandle tribes, Comanche and Kiowa, who are allied. Their chief Satanta is involved in some battles up here involving Fort Hays in 1867. Prairie Dog Creek, for one, up in Phillips County. And you also have out west, the main reason why tribal delegations upset about trespassing would be the Cheyenne, who've already went through a year earlier in 1864 a massacre at Sand Creek where they attacked a peaceful camp flying an American flag. So that'd be at the fall of Colonel Sivington, who thought it would be a great idea to go and attack a Native American tribe that was peaceful or happened to be. That doesn't mean every single member of the tribe is peaceful, but it does mean that the delegation they attacked was. And so you can't attack innocent people and say, look, we've solved the problem. All they did was make it worse. So Fort Fletcher out here in 1865 was just to protect the stagecoach line out to Denver. Well, it wasn't making a whole lot of money. The guy kind of went a little bit bankrupt, and by the spring 1866, the Army said, we can't justify this post anymore, so let's pull it up and say we're done. Well, October 1866, they re-garrison the fort, move it a quarter mile, I think, not that far from where old Fort Fletcher was. And old Fort Fletcher, all it was a bunch of sod buildings. So their infantry barracks and their store and everything for their provisions were all in sod buildings. They weren't amazingly built or anything. And then they had moved to a new location not too far away and named it Fort Hays. Now, we talked about Fort Fletcher being a living Missouri governor at the time. Well, Alexander Hayes happened to be a general that died in the Battle of the Wilderness in 1864 in Virginia. And that was one of the big famous battles. He was very good close friends with General Ulysses S. Grant and General Winfield Scott Hancock. And it was Winfield Scott Hancock that came out here with General George Armstrong Custer, who at that time was really a colonel in the Army. So General Winfield Scott Hancock, in honor of his friend who fell in battle, of course, named it Fort Hays.
Interesting. Yeah. So that is where, of course, the university now gets its name.
Eventually.
So with the renaming and relocating, that's kind of, it's a little confusing, I guess, when you first look at it. When it was first established as Fort Fletcher, I'm just trying to kind of paint a picture for people here. Where was that, and was the final location, is that where the historic site is at now?
Actually, the final location is in a different spot. So Fort Fletcher is about a few miles south of Walker, Kansas. So if you take the road south of Walker, you'll run into it. And then just right across the creek from that to the north west of it would be Old Fort Hays. The reason they closed Old Fort Hays in June of 1867, when Custer and his wife, Elizabeth Bacon Custer, who we call Libby, was out here, there was a big flood in the middle of the night. Now, there wasn't a moon out, so they didn't see anything. All they heard was rushing water. And sometimes when something like that happens and it rains over 16 to 20 inches at one time, which does occasionally happen even out here, whether it's hurricane related or not, and usually for us that's not at all. But it inundates the entire area. So they thought they'd build up high enough at Old Fort Hays to be protected. They built up on a small hill, and they were in the middle of the North Fork of Big Creek and Big Creek itself, one that we see that goes through campus, or used to go through campus a little bit more than it does now, but it's right by campus as it is. That amount of rainfall in such a very short period of time west of the fort took all their supplies downstream. It killed 7 troopers. Libby Custer dramatizes it in her book and talks about being tied with her black servant to a cannon so she doesn't float down the river or creek. Yeah, but we don't look at it like a thing that it could cause much damage right now, because generally speaking, Big Creek isn't going to until a big flood event like that. Well, it happened in June of 1867, and at the same time, they'd already made plans to move that location. It was guarding the Smoky Hill Trail. Old Fort Fletcher and Old Fort Hays were guarding the Smoky Hill Trail. That was superfluous at that time. So they moved the location up on higher ground, and it happens to be in a spot that was more protective of a new technology moving through for transportation. The railroad that was moving from Atchison and Leavenworth all the way through Fort Riley and Fort Harker through Fort Hays to the Goldfields and Denver. They for the Kansas Pacific Railway, they were charged with protecting that and the telegraph lines, which is also a newfangled technology. And at the time, that wired electrical communication was something that the Native Americans knew to attack because it would cut down communication between the posts and the farther west areas. And so then they can get away with taking out modern advancement or things that they thought were encroaching upon their own territory. So, yeah, a flood and the railroad are the reason why new Fort Hays, which I call it historic Fort Hays because Old Fort Hays means something else. The signposts from the 1960s used to say Old Fort Hays on it. This isn't Old Fort Hays. This is New Fort Hays plus historic Fort Hays. This is where all the buildings were for the longest period of time, 22 years, give or take. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So when Fort Hays came to its final location, what did it look like? What were the buildings that were here?
At its final location, the very beginning of it, like Hays City itself, at the very beginning for a few months, it was all a tent city. That was the cheapest. You could get everything out here and set up real quick. Most of the camp in Hays City were railroad workers, people building and grading the railroad, laying track and cutting logs for the railroad ties, and people with hammers hammering down the spikes to keep the rails in place. All kinds of manner of people out here working just to have a job. And those people working out there needed some protection from, at the time, Native Americans, especially the Cheyenne, the Kiowa, Comanche, and sometimes the Sioux and Arapaho. So you've got a lot of different groups out here at one point in time trying to hold on to their way of life. I think it's hard to say that even in this day, if somebody said, hey, you can't live there, someone else would say, well, don't tell me what to do. I'm going to fight back. And so a lot of them did. Of course, we know what happens if you do. It complicates things, and there's more bloodshed than it ought to be. If we go to the buildings, if we talk about the buildings, what they would have looked like about the fall and early part of 1868, late 1867, early 1868, they start constructing a lot of historic Fort Hays. And most of them are kit buildings that come in off of the new railroad that had just reached Hays City in that fall. So it's fairly easy to get a lot of people out here to put those buildings up fairly rapidly. The oldest building we have out here, though, is made out of limestone, and it's called the Blockhouse. Main part of it is a hexagon shape. They quarried that out of limestone just west here of the site, about a mile or so. Not too far away. You can almost see it from where we're at. And they took so long building that building that the quartermaster himself got into trouble for not putting up anything else, and winter was coming on. Of course, we know how it is on the plains with winter coming on and being up on a hill now. There's no protection from the wind whatsoever. If you look at old photographs of Hays City and the fort, which Alexander Gardner took in the, I think about August, September of 1867, you can see the tents on the hillside south of Hays City. And that's all it was, a massive tent city. So it took all those an army of contractors and a lot of soldiers put to work constructing these buildings. The barracks and the officers' quarters would have been the first ones put up. And then later you'd have your commissary and your guardhouse and some other things added over time. But there were multitudes of contractors out here working for the federal government at the time. Painters, blacksmiths, carpenters, just about everybody working together to make this all come together. So you've got people just making nails all day long. You've got another guy just hammering nails in all day long. And it might sound like it's easy to put up a kit thing together, but they had about 530 or so soldiers out here, including cavalry and infantry, in that fall and early winter. So they had quite a few people. That was almost the largest they ever got. They got a little bit larger about with the campaign down in Washita, Oklahoma territory, or Indian territory. But that's about how the buildings came together. There's some other fun stories with all the different ones at different times, but at the site right now, there are 4 of them that are mostly intact, and some a little bit modified, but mostly intact historical structures. They're not recreations, so they're the real thing.
Yeah. And can you explain what those are?
Yes, we do have 2 officers' quarters. House number 2 and house number 3 are set in their old foundation. They set up a little bit higher than what they would have. You can see, but the audience can't. There's a picture out here at the site that shows all the buildings, and most of them set almost flush with the ground. They did have a foundation, but they're flush with the ground. And the houses we have now, just to protect and preserve them just a little bit better than what they were then, they set up about 1.5 feet off the ground, so insects don't eat through the wood. And then we have the guardhouse that was built in 1873. That would have been the second iteration of a guardhouse out here, and it's made of limestone. So it's another reason why it really exists, is because the limestone is hardier. If you have a stone building, most people aren't going to go knock it down because of the effort it takes to do that. And wood frame buildings, of course, you can tell they're just always going to fall apart at some point if somebody's not taking care of it. And even at the time of the post, for the 22 years it was here, they constantly were maintaining the wood frame buildings all throughout the fort and talking about how the weather or insect damage or sun damage has done enough to the buildings themselves was either needing new coat of paint or dry rot or anything else. They needed new wood out here and new carpenters out here to work on this stuff all the time at some point, and didn't have the labor available like they did in 1867. And then the last building, of course, is the blockhouse, and that's the ultimate building out here. It was built as a defensive structure, and if you go in the interior of it, you can see rifle slots. So they'd intended there to be protracted siege warfare out here, and of course that doesn't happen. The tribes themselves are not moronic. They're not going to attack something that's going to get them killed. They'll do hit and run tactics specifically against targets they know they can probably defeat or at least rile up anyway and get their agenda across. Attacking a telegraph line without anybody on it, that's easy. Railroad workers who are unarmed, that's sort of easy. They're out there just doing a job. Or, a small group of soldiers that are at a stagecoach station, they might go by that and try to burn it down. So all our families moving across, if they happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong group of tribes, such as the dog soldiers, if you run into the wrong people, you're just in trouble. So that's all the buildings that we have out here. There is one other building that does exist. It is the post surgeon's quarters, and it is over at the K-State Experiment Station, only about a quarter mile east of here. So if we were to ever get another building back out here, that would be the next great thing, if that could happen.
Yeah. Well, it's very fitting that the buildings or some of the first buildings were made of limestone, because I think some people that's all they might know of Fort Hays or Hays
Yeah.
in general.
And if you look at Fort Hays State University, it's all limestone. And so it kind of fits with the old model of the fort in a way. But in a lot of ways, it surpassed it.
So once all of the buildings were built, people maybe didn't have to make nails and hammer nails all day. What did the day-to-day at the fort look like?
Oh, the day-to-day out here, it's mostly routine, and it would be boring enough that some of the soldiers would desert. Like, there's a call every so often, a bugle call every so often that puts you to task. Whether you're watering your horses, if you have them. Infantry don't have horses, but their officers might, and they might have a specific job where they might have to take care of their officer's horse. Or if there's cavalry, they're down there taking care of their animal. The musicians are practicing, or regimental musicians are practicing all day. They'll probably be in their barracks. There's marching and, of course, drill all throughout the day. There's cleanup where you take care of your building that you reside in and other buildings around you, and try to take care of that so it lasts as long as it can. And then there's other duties they might be put to as far as a job. So some of the jobs are contract, but sometimes it's given to soldiers. So a lot of times that ends up being a mistake. A soldier, like an enlisted man, might not necessarily know how to bake bread, and they put him in the wrong job, and of course he can't bake bread very well, and so the post has pretty bad bread for a moment of time. But then they have other contractors that might come out and work. Day to day, you'd also have wagon drivers that would take infantry along with them to supply Fort Larned or Fort Dodge. You'd have dispatches leaving from this post as well, either out west or back to Fort Hark, or delivering letters to the commanding officers in those posts. It's a small amount of patrols might go out, and if they hear of Indians in the area, they'll go and try to find them. Most times they end up empty-handed, not seeing even signs of them. Or they'll go after horse thieves or cattle rustlers or anybody trying to take advantage of somebody else. They'll send a unit out to try to stop that, or they'll guard wood cutting dispatches, contractors that were sent up to Solomon River Valley and the Saline River Valley to cut timber for the railroad ties. They'll do that kind of thing. It's really out here, you're waiting for something to happen, and then when it does happen, it happens so quickly that you can't even expect it. So it's kind of boring out here. And then the pastimes that they would do, they'd play, the officers' wives would play croquet, and the officers had access to a billiard table in the post trader's store with the officers' room attached to it. So they had ways of getting around being bored. Other pastimes include poker or gambling. And some of them played faro, some played poker. So some guys that didn't know how to bluff or were probably kind of fairly stupid, they might lose a lot of their money. And so they were probably enlisted men were making about $13 a month back in the 1860s, early 70s. And that's not a whole lot. So you've got them playing games, and they might show up to the post trader store and want to go in there and buy a can of peaches or something, and you find out when you walk in there it's 85 cents. You're like, well, I only made $13. I spent all of it on my laundress, taking care of my uniform and my blankets and stuff, and I've got this to pay. I can't afford peaches, so they don't. And so sometimes those guys that no fresh fruit, no fresh vegetables, nothing like that, they end up getting scurvy because they don't have the right nutrients. And it's generally speaking their fault, but also the Army's fault for not providing good enough food for them while they're at post. Those guys, some of them could be picky eaters and only eat hardtack and beef jerky. That might be the case, and biscuits, who knows, whatever, and coffee and beans maybe is all they eat. and they're not getting any nutrient out of that altogether that they need. So, um, other things around the fort that they might be doing, they may be assisting hay cutters in the area to feed their animals, and I mean the general day to day of the fort, it would be just straight boring, I think.
Yeah. So the soldiers who were here and then the higher ups who were here, are they people who are staying here for, 1 or 2 years? How long are people generally staying here?
The regiments themselves, infantry, lasted a little bit longer at this post. This is really an infantry fort. We think of the Wild West being a lot more cavalry related, and they're always chasing after Indians, and that's just not true for Fort Hays. It is in a small amount of it, but that's the most dramatic part of it, and it isn't like an all the time thing. But infantry were the backbone of the entire Western military force as far as guarding everything and protecting it. And the regiments themselves, most of them, even if they were, especially if they were cavalry, but even if they were infantry, they were only out here for a few months at a time, depending on what they were. And you're talking about like not having the whole regiment out here itself. So the 7th Cavalry was at Fort Hays, but it wasn't out here the whole time. They would set up camp west near Ellis, or they'd go up into Nebraska near Fort McPherson, or they'd go over down to Dodge or over to Fort Harker. They'd go all over the West and try to find something to do, or get some leads on some tribal group that's moving through and causing problems. And the infantry themselves, they would have lasted a little bit longer. If we look at specifically just the Buffalo Soldier units that were here, the 38th Infantry was here for at least 2 or 3 of the regiment or the companies were out here for about a whole year, from 67 to 68. And the 10th Cavalry, they were out here for, some of them were out here for a few months, from June to August, or July to November. So that's, you're not seeing a whole lot of people staying in the same place out here. It's changing all the time, and later on it becomes more static, and the same units out here for a little bit longer, a year, maybe 2 years, but still not enough to expect anything.
Yeah. Can you explain just a little bit who the Buffalo soldiers were?
Buffalo Soldier is something that we don't know if it was specifically Native Americans that made it up. It's possibly white or Western newspapermen or historians even that may have attributed a popular name for black soldiers to Buffalo Soldiers. It's kind of a misnomer as far as the name goes. It's not necessarily accurate because they were not called that at the time they were here. They were probably called far worse when they were here at Hays City. But the black soldiers, the units that were here, they were formed as some of the first black units during and after the Civil War. So 10th Cavalry was out here, and the 38th Infantry were out here, and they were out here at the beginning. So when we talk about who was constructing the buildings, yeah, we had contractors out here, but I can imagine quite a few of the soldiers were helping do that, and especially the black soldiers.
So aside from them, and then I know you talked a little bit about Custer. There are also some other kind of famous figures that, however briefly they were here. So who were some of those people?
Well, the fun part about Hays City and historic Fort Hays in that period of time in early 1867 to about 1869, 1870, when people start moving on from fame and move to different places. You've got very colorful figures out here. And of course, we just mentioned George Armstrong Custer, who was known as the Boy General in the Civil War. He was already famous. His wife, Elizabeth Bacon Custer, she was out here and writes about Fort Hays. She is basically the person that makes General Custer famous after the fact, after his death at Little Bighorn. She advocates for his legacy for the next 50 years afterwards. And then we have General Philip Sheridan, who was actually at the post. He was stationed in the main officers' quarters in the very center of Officers' Row throughout the campaign towards the Battle of Washita down in Indian Territory. General Sheridan was out here in 1868 and launched that campaign down to Indian Territory using General Custer at the time to attack, once again, Black Kettle, who is in a peaceful tribe and a peaceful part of the Cheyenne tribe. And this time, Black Kettle doesn't make it. Shivington, of course, attacks him in 1864. But once again happens. And Black Kettle, who is advocating for peace, ends up passing away. And this really tough part about Fort Hays is you end up getting 53 prisoners taken down there at the battle, or the massacre rather, and those prisoners are brought up to Fort Dodge and then Fort Hays, and they are set in a stockade in the middle of winter, and it's kind of a big open plan building. So it's fairly cold out here. They do have blankets, but they're prisoners. And the prisoners, there are 3 warriors among them. The rest of them are women and children. And they're used as leverage to put the rest of the Cheyenne onto reservation. It worked. They went along with it, and the hostages were returned. And the Cheyenne then did basically go onto reservation in Indian Territory. Other famous figures that were out here, Wild Bill Hickok, or James Butler Hickok is his real name, but Wild Bill Hickok, he a gambler, local lawman, becomes famous for some of the gunfights in Hays City. Some of them might have been blown a little bit out of proportion for what it was. He's famous in his time for being a gunfighter. He shows up in Harper's Weekly almost before anybody else does. He's a big name. As far as gunfight history goes, he's almost the first for that time period of the Wild West. And he has a very close friend that met him when he was only 12 years old. Not Hickok, but Cody, Buffalo Bill Cody. Frederick Cody was only 12 when he met Hickok up in Nebraska. And so they happened to be down here working as scouts for the Army and taking dispatch out to Fort Dodge or Fort Lyon out in Colorado. And those two became almost universally famous for being out here at that time period because of the dime novel industry. So there was a man by the name of Ned Buntline who wrote dime novels, and most of them were bull, I guess you'd say. So Buffalo Bill happens to run into Ned Buntline, who had just got off the railroad and was asking about Bill Hickok. And Cody is his guide and takes him to Hickok. But along the way, Buntline gets to know Cody, and Cody tells all these magnificent stories about buffalo hunts and everything else, and makes himself almost famous with his dime novelist on his exploits and what he did as a kid and what happened to his father back in Atchison, Kansas during Bleeding, Kansas. And so, you know, Cody makes it for himself almost, but he's just lucky enough to have had Ned Buntline run into him. Otherwise, Cody'd be nobody. And there's countless others that went through Hays City and, of course, were in a vicinity to historic Fort Hays at the time. The most famous people that anybody knows through history are going to be the cavalry officers.
Yeah. So you've sort of alluded to it a little bit already, but what was the relationship between the fort and then the city of Hayes?
I mean, we could probably expand it a little bit, but the city of Hayes has a lot of new citizens in it, and a lot of them are looking for work, and there's contract work to be had out here at Fort Hayes to supply the military. People that were at Hayes City that were living there, whether they were permanent residents or not, were working on the railroad. They were cutting hay for animals out here at Fort Hayes for the cavalry horses, or even the oxen or the mules that were the freight teams that were going down to Fort Dodge, or taking goods on the new nexus of the Santa Fe Trail here at Hayes. They'd set up a lot of depots here at Hayes City. And so for a year or so, Hayes City was the stop point for the railroad and the beginning point for the stage lines down to Santa Fe. And so all the trade network would have been going through Hayes City for about a year, about 1868. And of course, at some point, the railroad goes all the way through, and it doesn't. And Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad goes all the way through down there along the old trail, and so that Hayes kind of becomes a Passover country where it's not needed anymore. But as far as Hayes City goes, the fort and Hayes City are tied so economically together that the business and entrepreneurship that comes into Hayes City to supply food and drink and clothing and general store merchandise to everybody in the area, including the soldiers, they all become fairly wealthy in a short period of time. And the economy between the two is so highly ingrained that when the fort closes in 1889, the town worries about its future. What is it still going to be without the fort there?
So yeah, going forward from that, like you just said, the fort closes in 1889. What led to that?
Well, generally speaking, what led to it was all of the Indian wars that had happened in the 1840s onwards with the Plains natives. There's no need to continue a post out here if there are no more violent enterprises out here. So with the passing of Native American culture to reservations and the ending of the American bison on the entire Great Plains, that pretty much serves as the end of the fort. It pretty much, with the advancement of American settlement west, you see it basically kill itself.
But at that time, the city of Hayes is officially established and founded, correct?
Right. It's founded in 1867 in August, and the railroad reaches a couple months later in October. And by that time, it is a solid network city out here. Of course, it's got a reputation, a violent one, and by 1889, that violent reputation is long gone. It's mythic history. There's nothing really left of that. It's a built-up new town. It's trying to be something that just really becomes a stop point from somebody traveling across the country on the railroad, someplace for somebody to stop on their way out to Denver.
When it did close in 1889, from there, of course, I know that it kind of went a while then after that before anything was really done with it, but how eventually does the historic site and the museum come to be?
Okay. So for 13 years after 1889, the site lays dormant. And it's proposed at National Congress. It's uniquely formed that way. An argument is made to create a college out here at an experiment station for agriculture at the same time. And that happens in 1902, and they create what becomes Fort Hays State University. Those buildings that were out here a lot of them at that point for the next couple of years have been auctioned off or moved into the university. So the old hospital grounds was moved. There were two building complexes to it that were moved to campus. One of them they called the Pest House. The smaller version of it was moved right behind where Martin Allen Hall is now. And there was another larger building complex of it moved to about where Custer Hall is, or around in that area. So the university, when it started, utilized that hospital as the very first building for the Kansas Normal School, the western branch of the Kansas Normal School, which is a teacher's college. And you can kind of see the influence that it still has on the university programming itself. Fort Hays is still one of the top educator schools in the country for the size of the school it is, and despite that. So then later on, after most of the buildings have been sold off or moved away, the sheriff took residence in the blockhouse for a period of time in those years. And then by the 1920s, they established a golf course out here. And in that golf course used the blockhouse, the hexagon building with the rifle slots in it, as their clubhouse. That was their first clubhouse. By the 1950s, you start having historic park ideas come about. And even before that, maybe even in the 30s, you have Fort Hays Historic Park, and the buildings that are out here at that point in time are just the guardhouse and just the blockhouse. I don't know what the contents of their museum would have looked like, but you do see roadside picnic tables put up here, trees planted. You see the pine trees that are out here still to this day, and they're not a native tree, so they tried to dress it up to look like a 1960s looking kind of national park site to be a little bit more appealing to the eye. And by 1970s, you get the visitor center built out here. Late 60s, you have, and early 70s, you have some archaeological digs that are happening where all the building sites used to be at. And you can look at pictures of those on Kansas Memory and see what the site looked like. There would have been a parking lot just south of the blockhouse. That would have still been the main parking lot for the golf course. And then, of course, by the 1980s, we get our last building moved back out here, and it is the most intact of the officers' quarters, but it's house number 2 out here right now. That is all of the buildings that kind of survived and what happened to them. The houses were moved into town, and people lived in them. That's why those two in particular happen to still be around. People have kept them for 100 years, and so we're lucky to have, honestly, anything out here. The historic park itself, like Frontier Park and the Buffalo Pen, the golf course itself, and of course the experiment station ground, it's all still state-owned territory. So the military reservation that was here is still basically all state land.
With everything that we've talked about, why was, having this museum here, having the old buildings preserved, why was that seen as important? What impact were they trying to preserve?
Well, some of it's cultural, American cultural, like 1950s, 1960s American cultural, where the predominant shows on TV and some of the main movies are Westerns. And they're looking at that old mythic story of the West. And Fort Hays was a big part of that beginning story. It's usually a footnote in a history book now, but at the time, it was world famous. Like we've talked about, all the famous figures that were here, all the people that made Fort Hays sort of on the map at the time, including the Native Americans and the black troops and the colorful figures that go on to be notorious in a way. They all have some impact on Wild West history, and so it's kind of nice to be able to put all the pieces together in one specific location, and that's Fort Hays.
Awesome. Well, it's definitely cool to see it here, and I know it's a cool place to come visit.
Yeah, and it's free admission.
Yes, exactly. So I think that will be where we end for today, but thank you again so much for chatting with me about this.
Yep, thank you, Reagan.
And thank you for listening to History in Hays. Tune in to our second episode to learn about how violent Hays was in its early days.